Sound the alarm bells. Because we have an emergency podcast here today on Brandon's World because March 10th, 2026 may have gone down one of the wildest nights in the history of sports. Not only did the USA lose to Italy in the World Baseball Classic, manager Mark DeRosa didn't even know that USA couldn't even make the quarterfinals. Bam Adebayo scored 83 points in a basketball game, which we'll get to. But Maxx Crosby is also no longer a Baltimore Raven, and he may end up staying in Las Vegas because the Baltimore Ravens reportedly got cold feet. They say Maxx Crosby did not fail his physical. The Raiders and multiple NFL GMs are calling BS on him and the potential impact there because, the Raiders have obviously moved on. They went out, they signed Tyler Linderbaum to that $27 million deal, which, maybe one of the reasons why Baltimore was upset at Vegas because of Baltimore, I think, assumed that Linderbaum was going to come back, but they felt like that was an extraordinary number for a center that was an offensive lineman is important. I don't know if anybody would pay 25 plus million, let alone 27 million for an offensive lineman per year. I think Baltimore thought that was an extraordinary contract. And yes, I do think the Ravens may have gotten cold feet on Maxx Crosby, who says, he got cleaned up surgery in the offseason. He's going to be ready by training camp. It's a very weird situation. Listen, Baltimore over the past few years yeah, really has been a very interesting organization, right? From the dynamics of John Harbaugh leaving to the dynamics of Lamar Jackson's contract situation. Maybe John Harbaugh saw this train coming down the tracks. And, for the Raiders, I find it really interesting because the reports are that they are going to keep, obviously, all the free agents they did sign. They're not going to back out of it. They did think, obviously, they're going to have a lot more cap room without Maxx Crosby than Maxx Crosby on it. But Maxx Crosby on a Raiders team that all of a sudden, obviously, brought into Kobe Dean. They bring in Tyler Linderbaum, obviously, and all the other guys that they go on and sign, they were at the receiver position to go along with Arch Manning. They brought in a couple linebackers. They bring back Eric Stokes. They are building a team that, along with Fernando Mendoza, they believe can win this year. And they already have Brock Bowers at tight end and all pro. I think he's going to be eventually and all pro, and Ashton Genty at running back. You have Quinn Kubiak, who with Seattle under Sam Darnold took a team that won 10 games, was very, very good, but wasn't even a playoff team a year ago, and they won the Super Bowl. And I think Vegas is going to try to replicate the formula that Seattle had. And that was, listen, we're going to build, around the quarterback, but we're going to give him weapons. We're going to give him a great offensive line. We're going to give him a run game. And obviously, we're going to give him a defense. And in my opinion, that starts with Maxx Crosby. And I think the Raiders are doing this right. I think the Raiders have undoubtedly improved. It reminds me a lot of the Patriots. Now, maybe Fernando Mendoza is a year behind where Drake May was, but it does remind me a lot of the way the Patriots built a year ago. Now, they are in a very difficult division. Nobody will deny that. But the Raiders, in my opinion, all of a sudden they go from basement dwellers to, depending on how well Fernando Mendoza plays, because this could be a Caleb Williams situation, where they have all the talent in the world, but maybe they're a year away. But if I'm the Raiders, and this could all change, that's why I'm doing this an emergency podcast very early in the morning here, before I even start work, which is why my camera may look a little dim in the lighting. It could all change. But if I'm the Raiders personally, obviously the reports are they're open to keeping Maxx Crosby, and I will. The ripple effects for the Baltimore Ravens is, they no longer have two first round picks. They no longer have their center in Tyler Linderbaum. They lost a couple other offensive linemen in free agency. And the old saving grace around that for Baltimore was, well, we have Maxx Crosby. maybe our offensive line won't be as good, but our defense is going to be amazing. And, Jesse Minter coming from the Chargers, and their new offensive coordinator, Declan Doyle, come from Denver. They both seen Maxx Crosby physically wreck games. I know they wanted Maxx Crosby. Maybe there's a rocky relationship there in the front office. Maybe it affects how they negotiate Lamar Jackson's potential new contract. They need to go out. I think they need to give Lamar Jackson now a legit weapon at wide receiver to make him happy. I don't know. It's weird in Baltimore. It's almost as weird as the Trey Henderson situation in Cincinnati, which now there's a lot of speculation the Ravens may go out and just sign Trey Henderson, which again would lead to more of the cold feet scenario than it would the fact that Maxx Crosby field is physical. I don't really see how when you have off-season surgery, and again, unless they spotted something, I also think it's where the Maxx Crosby hasn't issued any public statement yet, like failing my physical was BS. Because the other thing is, now if the Raiders do trade him, they're going to not get two first-round picks. You certainly could get a one for Maxx Crosby, but you have now lost your leverage because you've seen the package that it takes, and now you have to give up undoubtedly less because there's going to be questions about Maxx Crosby's physical health. So it's a wild story. I said last year I thought the Ravens were heading in the wrong direction. And I've said this about Buffalo too, because it applies to them. Both Buffalo and Baltimore are chasing Kansas City. Now Buffalo has to deal with New England in their division. Baltimore's obviously to deal with Joe Burrow when LD the Steelers, when they add Mike Tomlin or not. Depending on what they have with Aaron Rodgers, they go out, they get Michael Pittman. They're always going to be a decent football team. Um, excuse me. When you are chasing not only um people in your division, but you can't get past Kansas City, and in Baltimore's case, you can't get past Buffalo in the playoffs. Sometimes it makes you crazy. You know, excuse me. My allergies are acting up today, folks, because of the rain. Sometimes it makes you do weird things, and sometimes your window closes faster than you expected. And so, in my opinion, I think what happens is there's a lot of emotional ways that teams end seasons, and sometimes they don't recover from it. I thought Baltimore was going to take a step back last year. Now, obviously, I thought they did some more because of the Lamar Jackson injury. But even going into the year, I thought 2 years ago, the year that Mark Andrews dropped that pass, and then obviously the year before that when they were in the AFC Championship game and they refused to run the football with Derrick Henry against Kansas City, I thought that was Baltimore's window. And, maybe Jesse Minter, he's a great defensive mind, obviously. We saw what he did with the Chargers. So I think he will get that defense better. But I think this could be a weird situation for the Baltimore Ravens moving forward. And now, with that, folks, we're going to go ahead. We're going to do a live transition here. If you're watching on video, you're going to see my background change because we're going to experiment with something today. We're going to do one clip on the YouTube side of things. Let's talk about Bam Adebayo scoring 83 points last night with like 15 of them coming from the free throw line within the last minute. Listen, Bam Adebayo had a great night. It is the Wizards who are just an absolute terrible franchise. But yes, Miami was doing the 2K thing. They were stat adding at the end. Now, there's no denying that I'm not talking about Kobe Bryant in his 81-point game where he dominated Jalen Rose. But in his last game, a celebratory game, Kobe was trying to score every single point he possibly could. But again, he's one of the biggest legends of all time. It was his final game. You don't typically see teams up 20 intentionally fouling. It's funny in baseball we talk about, the unwritten rules a lot. We don't really talk about it in basketball. In football, we actually talk about it a little bit more. It's like, on a QB kneel, you're not supposed to go after a guy. You sort of accept defeat, those kind of things. In basketball, I would think the unwritten rule is kind of, if you're up 20 with a minute left, don't try to shoot a bunch of threes and run up the score and all that. Um, that would be really the only one written rule. And Miami kind of, and Washington broke that last night with allowing that and, getting Bam Adebayo these extra points and making 20 plus free throws. Yes, he got 83. Yes, it will go down in the record books. It was an amazing night, and he got probably 65 or 70 of those legitimately. But yeah, towards the end, it doesn't make it feel like a real 81. It was an NBA 2K hunt for record breaking, which I have no problem doing in a video game. I have problem doing in real life. And, the Wizards gave up over 150 points last night. And listen, and there's a huge problem in the NBA right now. Thunder Nuggets was a great game Monday night. It was also 129 to 126. I do think there's such a thing as too high scoring in basketball. I do want to see some defense. Um, it's funny because Bam Adebayo is a good player. He's a multi-time All-Star. He's never been considered the number one guy. Even this year, it's kind of viewed as a shared role with him and Tyler Hero. I thought he played very well with Jimmy Butler in the 2020 and 2023 NBA Finals. So he's gotten back to the finals twice. I thought he matched up well with Nikola Jokic even in that 2023 finals. I thought he played pretty decent against AD in the 2020 finals. But he's never been viewed as a scorer. He averages what, 18 or so? I didn't even look this up. What does he average? 18 or so, 10 rebounds a game. He's not even ever really been considered the best center in his own conference. Joel Embiid, Jared Allen. I think now even Jalen Duren, I would personally take over Bam Adebayo. Cat now plays the five there, obviously, New York. Vucevic, who I've always been a big fan of, whether he's been in Orlando, Chicago, or Boston. I think of all of those guys before I think of the Bam. So, no shot at Bam on a bio. And to me, this is the power of the NFL and baseball, really, because this was the third biggest story of the night, you could argue, last night. Over, the NFL was obviously first, Maxx Crosby, and then you can make a debate over USA getting pounded by Italy. Mark DeRosa not knowing that USA could be eliminated before getting to the quarterfinals based off the runs they gave up last night to Italy. And then there's this story, which again I think is a bigger problem for the NBA. I love the way that NBC did sort of the live check-in. I don't think ESPN would have did that. I'll be honest. I think Amazon Prime would have, which is why I'm so glad the NBA does have NBC and Amazon Prime. I said it before. I would have moved off ESPN. I know it's a bold statement, but to me, the ESPN is embedded with the NFL. If I'm the NBA, I would have moved off ESPN. I would have done TNT, I would have done NBC, and I would have done Prime for my free media rights deals. So I'm glad that NBC celebrated it in the mix of a pretty good game between the Celtics and the Spurs. Um, it will go down as maybe the weirdest game in NBA history and one of the weirdest stats in NBA history. Hey, who scored the second most points in an NBA game ever? Oh, it's not Kobe Bryant. It's Bam Adebayo. Again, really good player, but bottom line is it'll make him famous and may not even make him famous on a Jeopardy question. Do you ever ask who scored the second most points in an NBA game in history? Maybe the question is who scored 83 points in a game in NBA history? And I would argue non-sports fans will have no idea it was Bam Adebayo. And I've said this before. Everybody flips out about Donovan Mitchell scoring 70 a few years ago, and Giannis I think put up 70, and Devin Booker I remember put up 70. Loss. And that's the thing is, you know, 50 to me is the new 40. 60 is probably the new 50. Now 83 is certainly out of this world, but it is certainly easier to score in today's NBA. Um, which is why again, yes, Bam Adebayo had a legitimate night, one of the greatest nights of his career. He'll remember it forever. But it was stat, I don't know, would have been in the end. It was just a weird anomaly night in sports, as today is the 6 year anniversary of the NBA. I believe that game was in OKC. I could be wrong. I thought it was Thunder Jazz, but I could be wrong. Of the NBA shutting down due to the global pandemic. And I said yesterday, March 10th, 2026, was going to be a weird day because March 10th, 2020 was the day I found out at my college, Kent State University, that I had to get out within 24 hours because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And who knows, maybe today, March 11th, will bring something crazy. So tomorrow, I bring on friend of the show, David Profusic. We're talking all things college sports here, college sports expert. We talk who holds his legacy. We talk the expansion of the college football playoff. We're talking March Madness. All that and more, which I we're doing an emergency podcast today. One clip on YouTube. Maxx Crosby is no longer a Raven. Bam Adebayo scores 83 points. We'll see what happens today between Italy and Mexico if USA can get into the quarterfinals of the World Baseball Classic. Enjoy your Wednesday. This has been Brandon's World on March 11, 2026. And peace.